My name is Tomás Ybarra-Frausto. I was born in Comal County, New Braunfels, Texas, in 1938. I wanted to come back home because San Antonio was really, in my heart. And the San Antonio that I remember, I was growing up in San Antonio around the Second World War. And it was a different San Antonio than today. It was still the last remnants of Jim Crow and segregation. The theaters were segregated, and there was a line that was sort of like the Anglo line. I think it was Wolf and Marks, the department store, and from Wolf and Marks west was the Mexican-American community. I was born on the west side, and a modest working class father. He was a plumber, and it was a wonderful period to grow up in. Later on, when I became interested in literature, this was a time when San Antonio had many theaters, and particularly vaudeville. And I was really interested had the Teatro Zaragoza, the Teatro Nacional, and later the Alameda on Commerce Street. And I was very interested in because they had a movie, and then after the movie they had like a half hour of singing and dancing vaudeville acts, with comedic sketches and I was always wondering what happened to the people that were performing when the movies came on. Where did they go? What did they do? And so one day I sneaked back, and this was the theaters were sort of like hierarchical. The Zaragoza was the poor man's theater. It had benches instead of chairs, and then the Nacional was much more exclusive, and then the Alameda was the top of the line. But I remember like going to the Zaragoza, and when they'd had young ladies like cigarette girls going down the aisle selling candy and popcorn, and so you were, I was a child, 10, 8. They would pass the candy or the popcorn, the box of popcorn, the bag of popcorn, all the way down. And if you were sitting at the end, by the time it got to you, everybody had put in and eaten, part of so you got that much of the popcorn. So it was a very communal and kind of rowdy. A lot of kids went, and so I became very much interested in the theater, and I was particularly interested in women. There was a very famous comedian. Her name was La Chata Noluesca. And I was interested in her because she was able to tell very crude, sort of blue jokes, and everybody laughed, and yet this was like a language that most women were not supposed to speak. So I was interested in her, and how she got around it was to be in the persona of a little girl. With little pigtails and stockings, brightly colored stockings, so she'd come prancing out, and she could, as a naughty little girl, she could say things that as a woman she was prohibited from saying. So I got to be very interested in language and how language works. I went to Brackenridge High School, and San Antonio at that time, it was very much related to Mexico. So on Friday evenings, my dad, my mom, I had a brother and a sister. There were 5 of us in the family. We'd sit around a big console, a Philco radio, and turn on to XEQ and XCW, which were the most powerful stations from Mexico City. And I was very interested in detective stories, so they had a detective story of this detective called El Inspector La Croa. Inspector Lacroix, and his assistant Margot. And he would say, "Shoot, Margot, shoot," and you would hear the bang, bang. And I really got very interested in terms of how, through radio, you made your own images in your head. You would hear the steps going down, somebody going down the stairs, and then the creeping of the door, screeching of the door as it opened, and somebody screaming. It was all very, very excited. And so also, San Antonio had bilingual, bicultural newspapers. So La Prensa was very much one of the daily newspapers. And so my father used to read to us on Sundays from La Prensa. We were just learning to read, so he could read to us and we would just listen orally. And La Prensa had a lot of, he read, for example, Alexander Dumas' Los Tres Mosqueteros, the Three Musketeers, which I liked. And then he would read us Bleak House, Dickens. So I thought that Alexander Dumas and Charles Dickens were Chicanos, Mexican Americans, because they were translated in Spanish. But La Prensa was very important because even though there was a working class community, La Prensa made accessible world literature, and many people were savvy and were literate in world literature, as well as it published writers from San Antonio and so on. So San Antonio has always had a strong literary tradition of both English and Spanish, and also a theatrical tradition, artistic tradition. So I grew up in a world, discursive world, also with sayings. Everybody would. I loved the way people talked in San Antonio. They mixed Spanish and English, Spanglish, and they began. They would begin a sentence in English and then they would continue in Spanish, and they always would use refranes, sayings, like some of them were very important because they were teaching us as a young boy. I was learning kind of the structure of the community, the deep structures of feeling, the deep structures of understanding the world view with the refrains and the sayings. For example, one my dad would always say was, uno trabaja para vivir, no vive para trabajar. One works in order to live. One doesn't live in order to work, which was very interesting in a culture in the United States where working and making a living is very important, but he was always saying that making a life is more important, and making a life is different from making a living. When I would ask my grandfather, when we got here, he would say, we've been here desde siempre. We've been here since always, since forever. And I always wondered what that really meant, because he had a ranch when I was born in New Braunfels, a cotton ranch, and he had workers that came to work at the ranch. And my mother was one of those workers that came with her family, and she met my dad, who was the son of the owner of the ranch, and they got married. And so it joined the northern Texas and the sort of southern Tejanos, but he was kind of like a cowboy. He was very boisterous and would sing, had a guitar. And so growing up, I grew up first in the rancho. And of course, in that time, a lot of the people in New Braunfels spoke German. So all my class, the little boys and girls that I played with were all German speaking. So I had to speak German, and so at home at the rancho we spoke Spanish. And then when I had playmates or I would go and visit them, we'd speak in German. And so my grandfather spoke German very, very well. And then he lost the ranch. He was a gambler and lost the ranch, and he had to come. My father was the one son that took sort of pity on him and brought him to San Antonio. And that's how I got to San Antonio and the West Side. I love to read, and I would go to the San Antonio Public Library. And at that time, the San Antonio Public Library was where the Briscoe Museum is now, in that same building. And it's a very beautiful building. But at the very top floor, they had a permanent collection of circus, a big circus. Well, it was tiny circus because it was all the elements of a circus done to scale. But the most interesting thing that it had for me was they had a little man all dressed up in a frock coat with a top hat, and next to him was this small lady dressed up in a wedding gown, and it was Thumb Thumb, the famous midget that they had. When he died, I guess they embalmed him, and so he was standing there in his wedding outfit, and his bride was next to him. And I always, this idea of these small creatures being human beings, and then going around and seeing all the freaks in the shows, the women with two heads, and the most interesting thing to me was that there was a little box, and supposedly the little what it said, that this little box was a piece of Thumb Thumb and Lavinia's cake from their marriage, and it looked like a piece of coal, and I always wondered what it would taste like. So I would always go up there and look at it and wanted to taste it, but I never did, of course. And at the library, I was such an avid reader. I've loved librarians and libraries and books since I was a child. At that time, the children's collection was separate. I think it still is. But your card, you got a child's card, and then when you were like 15, you could then get an adult card. So I had a child's card, but I wanted to explore the adult books. And so one librarian gave me permission to go into the stacks and look at the adult books. And of course, by this time I was 11 or 12 years old, and I immediately went to books that had pictures, like Guy de Maupassant, the prostitutes in Paris, and things like that, And I said, oh my gosh, this is a whole new world. But I was reading and learning about other worlds, and the library became like a sanctuary. It's always been this sort of very special place where you could go and go into another world, I would always look in the card catalog, which they had then before, we went from analog to digital information. I would always go to the card index and look for my name, hoping to see that somebody like me had written something. And finally one day I was very astonished to find a book written by T. Ybarra, and my name is Tomás Ybarra, T. Ybarra. And so I checked the book out, and it was a book called Young Men of Caracas, and it was about a young boy growing up in Caracas and the barrio and the sounds of Caracas and the metropolis of Caracas. And I thought, well, one day maybe somebody will write about San Antonio in those terms, about the language and the food people eat and how they live in this metropolis. And of course now, for my grandnephews and grandnieces, they can go to the library and find books written by Tomás Ybarra, including some written by myself. So the library was a lifeline to learning. Brackenridge High School, and at that time there were two college prep schools, Brackenridge and Jefferson. And I picked Brackenridge not because it was better than Jefferson, but because it had a wonderful band, and I loved music. So I said, I'll go there. I couldn't play any instruments, but it was a place that had a wonderful band, and I went to Brack, and it was there. I was a member of many of the clubs, and I was in ROTC. I was a cadet colonel of the ROTC, and so I decided to go. I knew I was going to college because my father was always my parents, my dad and my mom, were all very interested in education. And they always would tell me the story. They would say, you know, si ganas mucho dinero, viene alguien y te lo roba. If you earn a lot of money, maybe somebody will come and steal it from you. But if you get educated, it's a treasure. It's a treasure that nobody can take away from you. It's something that you have within you, and it's a world that you have within you that nobody can take away. And so with that dictum, I became very interested in knowledge and education. My dad, always when he came home from work, dead tired, he was a blue-collar worker, but when he came home, he would always open a book and start drawing. And he would draw houses. He was like an architect. He decided where the bathroom, and I would be sitting next to him, and he would tell me, well, here we'll put the bathroom, and no, and the roof will be this way because of the water and whatever in San Antonio. And so he had left a lot of sketchbooks of architecture. But since he was a blue-collar worker, he never went to university and never could become an architect. So in many ways, I was destined to be what my father never could accomplish, which was to be a letrado, a man of letters. So I went to the University of Texas, and everywhere I've gone, it's been sort of like a marvelous, serendipitous journey. I was studying at the University of Texas with a very famous scholar from Yale University, who came, and he was this is in the 1950s now, during the Sputnik era, when Russia was sending space shuttles and sending people to the moon, and the United States was lagging behind. So the government spent a lot of money on the National Defense Educational Act, which was to provide money to teach young children languages so that the United States could be in the world and talk to people and maybe create a world where we could communicate across borders and across cultures. And so I was studying how to be a language teacher with this very famous professor from Yale. And one day I opened Life magazine, and Life at that time had big spreads, 2-page spreads, and there were this wonderful picture of like 11 men and one beautiful woman. And I said, what is this? Where is this? I was in Austin, it was hot, summery, and they were in this sort of rainforest, you know, it was glittering, the leaves were glittering, and I said, I want to go there. And my professor said, oh, my best friend teaches at the University of Washington. And they're getting NDA Summer Institute, why don't you go? And I will talk to him, and he teaches French, and I knew Italian and French and Spanish, and he said, well, you can be a teacher for this Summer Institute. So I went to Seattle, and I began teaching young children, Spanish and Italian, and I lived in a little town right next to Seattle called Bellevue, Washington, which was a really ritzy place. Everybody had, private libraries, and that's where now the Gates and all the important people, the millionaires, the dot-com millionaires live in this little town, Bellevue, right on the waterfront. And so I lived there and lived the life of Riley, learned how to ski, and totally away from San Antonio and whatever. And I find out that the men in this picture were the Northwest School of Painters, Mark Tobey, Morris Graves, and all of them, 11 of them. And the beautiful young woman was Zoe Duzain. She was their muse. And so when I got there, I met Zoe Duzain, and she had a gallery that showed all these people. And so I began being involved in the art world in Seattle, particularly with Native American arts. So one day I took the Greyhound bus across the Cascade Mountains to Eastern Washington. And this is really significant in my life because I got there on a Saturday night, and the young men were walking around, white shirts, starched white shirts, looking at the girls that were coming by in the paseo, just like in Mexico, flirting and looking deeply into their eyes. And you had this frisson, what was going on. And they were all Mexicans, and I never had been there. So I followed them to this Mexican restaurant, and had a huge bowl of pozole and tortillas. And I said, wow, this is like little Mexico. El México de afuera, the Mexico outside of Mexico. And then I realized that a lot of them were people from Texas, mainly from South Texas, who would go every year to pick the hops and the apples. And pretty soon they began staying there. I mean, it got to be too much trouble to come back. And they began forming communities. So one day I went to church, and the church was segregated. The growers sat downstairs, and the workers sat upstairs in the little balcony. And coming from San Antonio, when here, we were mainly the majority Spanish speakers, and everybody was like me. Up there, all of a sudden I realized what I said. Well, I started inquiring, and I said, well, do you vote? If you could vote, you could vote yourself into the mayorship and into the school board and take control of this little town. This is about the very same time that Cesar Chavez was organizing the farm workers in California. And so I became very involved with the community activism, and particularly with migrant education, because I was an educator, and teaching. What happened, we wanted to create a system where the people that came, let's say, from South Texas and went to Washington, the children, when they went to school, they might have been in 4th grade in Texas, and they put them in the 2nd grade over there because they couldn't, their records, they didn't have a system of transferring the records. So we began working on this record transfer, and I began meeting the community. And I found, again, like in San Antonio, a very rich community. And I decided, well, I had studied theater and had learned theater in San Antonio, and I had studied theater at the University of Washington, and at my doctorate at the University of Washington was in art, music, and literature. And I decided to have a theater. And so I said, well, there's somebody here who could play the guitar. The women can all sew, they can make the costumes. I can find somebody to build the sets. And so I established this theater, but the only theater I knew was Golden Age theater, Spanish from Spain, Spanish theater of the Golden Age. But I realized that a lot of the entremeses, the short plays, Lope de Vega and other famous classical artists, that literature is universal. All literature talks about our concerns, our dreams, our desires, our fears. And so I decided, what if I teach Golden Age theater to these farm workers? And they would learn it, and that's what we would present. And this is the time when Luis Valdez was starting the Teatro Campesino, the famous farm workers theater in California. And so I started my theater, but his theater, Luis's theater in California, was composed mainly of college students who were learning theater and actually learned about theater, and he himself was a theater director. And I was just a person from the community working with working class communities. It was a very significant life lesson for me, because I discovered the wealth of working class community. There are a lot of people who come to culture not through the written word, but through orality. People could sing, they could recite, and so the entremeses, pretty soon I had a theater group. We traveled all over, and of course the entremeses are all about, some of them are about farm workers in Spain in the 16th century, and it was the same story. So I began realizing how culture and literature, are significant in our lives. I was in the Northwest when all of a sudden I got a letter from Stanford University, and I had just finished my PhD, and they invited me to be an assistant professor, a young assistant professor at Stanford, which was quite a coup in those days. And so I went to Stanford, And I love San Francisco. And again, it was a very serendipitous journey. I met, people in the arts and the humanities, writers. I lived in the Mission District, which was the Latino, and it was interesting because it was not just Mexican Americans. There were many Salvadorians, there were people from Cuba, so the art world there was Latin from all the 23 countries in Latin America, and the Mission District in San Francisco was a Latino rather than a Mexican American community. I have always been interested in everything, so I decided that I was going to focus on the essay, to teach the essay. So rather than the novel or poetry or short stories, because with the essay you can talk about everything. There's essays about architecture, there's essays about gardening, there's essays about food, and so I would assign, all these essays about all kinds of projects, and of course the Stanford students were, the cream of the crop. They were wonderful students, and there were, like 6 students around the table. The Socratic method, I would ask them questions, they would ask me questions, and we learned together. It was a wonderful experience. I got my tenure there, and when you get tenure, that's your life sentence. I mean, you can stay forever and ever unless you do some egregious thing. You've got a job forever. Just about maybe several months when I got tenure, I got a letter from the Rockefeller Foundation in New York, and their director of arts and humanities had left, and they were looking for somebody, and somehow through the intellectual grapevine, they had heard about me and my work at Stanford, and so they invited me to come to Manhattan. And so I went to the Algonquin Hotel and began learning about another sort of wonderful time, and I did a whole series of interviews with all the board of the foundation. The foundation had been in the 50s very involved in Mexico and in Latin America, so they wanted to revive programs to assist artists and writers in Latin America, and I seemed to fit the bill. And so I passed all the tests, meaning, the dinners and meeting all these, the board chairman and all these people in business and titans of this and titans of that, and having conversations with them. And so then they said, yeah, this is the guy. So I was anointed and began to be Associate Director of Arts and Humanities for the Rockefeller Foundation, which opened up the whole world to me, because I then traveled throughout Latin America, through Europe. The foundation has a villa in Italy, in Bellagio. So I would go to Bellagio and travel throughout Europe. And so we funded many, many projects. It was wonderful to have millions of dollars in your budget just to give out to people that were doing wonderful work in the humanities. And so that was my life in New York. I was there for 25 years, and I retired from the Rockefeller Foundation. My life has been full of joy, full of knowledge, and full of the reassurance, that no matter what is going wrong, our hearts and our minds blended together will create, a new society. Always I'm very excited because this country, no matter what travails we're going through, is still an experiment. We haven't completed the experiment. And now as I'm an elder, and I'm trying to learn how to be an elder because I still feel quite young. I know that I won't see the final end to this experiment, where I hope we will have a country that will be more inclusive and more equitable and more interested in nature, and where there will be communities of sentiment. Three things: family, money, and health. Family, because I have a brother. My sister died, unfortunately, when she was in her 40s. I have a brother, but he's much younger. So I didn't get to know him as I was growing up in San Antonio. I mean, I would come Christmas and holidays, to visit my parents, and he would always be there. And of course, I knew him, but he was in like elementary school when I was in high school. So, and then I went away to college, and then I went to Stanford, and then I went to New York. So it was like 45 years, and I was gone, and I would just see him periodically. And I wanted to get to know him. He's my only sibling, and he has two daughters, and each of his daughters has two children, and so they're my grandnephews and my grandnieces, and I wanted to know them as a family, and it's been great. My brother has been really solicitous, and he's a great father, and just like our parents, he is inculcating their kids, how to be bicultural and bilingual, and so I've been enclosed by him, and since I knew a lot of the artists and the writers and so on in San Antonio, I found myself another embrace by this other communities. So I came, just as if I had never left, and so that was one reason, family, and the other was money. After I finished with the Rockefeller Foundation, I retired and I had some money and some investments and things, but I was no longer working, and certainly now San Antonio is getting about as expensive as New York. Some of the condos and things are about the same, about $1,000 per room. So the food is still, a little bit less. So economics, I felt that I could, and it has proven that way. Well, I think that throughout my life, which has been a very rich and serendipitous journey, I'm particularly proud of the medal that the Mexican government gave me, which is the Order of the Aztec Eagle, which is the highest honor that the Mexican government can bestow upon someone who is not a Mexican citizen. And it was given to me for my work in the arts and the humanities, and for building bridges of understanding across the two cultures. So that was when I was working at the Rockefeller Foundation in New York, where I worked for like 25 years, and my areas were Latin America, Africa, and Asia in the arts and humanities. And so it was a wonderful time in Manhattan. In all my literary career, I just think, that there are three questions that we all try to answer. Who am I? Where do I come from? And where am I going? Who am I? What is my identity? Where do I come from? What is my heritage? Where am I going? What is my vision for the future? And so I think this year, in our 300th anniversary, not only for San Antonio, but also for the country and for the world, we're again at a moment when we're asking, who am I? As a country, as a nation, as a universe, where do we come from? What is our heritage? What is our lineage? And where are we going? What are our hopes? What are our dreams? And I look forward to many, many more years.